Libya was one of the most promising nations on the African continent. But why did it fall? See, when I was younger and I would ask this question, the answer I would usually get was that the West intervened in Libya, and this led to the downfall of Muammar Gaddafi. The downfall of Muammar Gaddafi was the downfall of Libya. Now, initially, this explanation was sufficient for me. However, as I've grown older, I've now seen that maybe that is not entirely the full story. So I've now dedicated this particular series to try and understand what exactly led to the downfall of Libya. And for our first episode, we look at the Monarchy Constitution. So join me as we look at the fall of Libya. Now, the first thing we're going to be looking at when we're trying to understand the fall of Libya is the Monarchy Constitution. So let's talk about it. What was the Monarchy Constitution? Well, you see, after World War II, Italy and Germany lost control of Libya, and it was now given to France and Britain. Britain were to administer Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. Yo, Tripoli for short, because the pronunciation is going to get me all twisted up. And France was given Fezzan. Now, you see, the major powers, Britain and France, didn't know what to do. They couldn't agree on the future of these three regions. And so they looked to the United Nations to give them guidance. So on November 1949, the UN General Assembly then established Resolution 289 that Libya shall now become an independent state, an independent country by January 1952. The UN Commissioner Adrian Pelt was appointed. The National Assembly was formed with representatives from Libya's three regions. Together, they drafted a constitution. Right? The document created a federal monarchy, a king, a parliament, provincial governments. It was a compromise designed to hold three very different regions together, right? Because as I've just mentioned to you, just imagine two regions being administered by Britain, another region being administered by France. It was hectic to try and find a way in which these three regions can now operate with each other. On paper, it was Libya's first modern institution, but in practice, it was a superstructure waiting for a substructure. What I mean by this is when we talk about the superstructure that was waiting for a substructure, the necessary superstructure that was there was parliament. But now the substructure that the superstructure needed was the political parties. So you can have a house, but you need the foundation to make sure that the house is not bulldozed over or the house does not collapse. So, but that's on the disadvantages. When we're looking at the disadvantages, we just want to now just focus on the advantages in the meantime. So we now move on to the advantages of this particular system. So for its first decade, the first advantage that we look at is the regional balance. I mentioned how these were three different regions. All these regions were operating on different wavelengths. At least the monarchy constitution brought them all together. The second advantage was international legitimacy. Yes, the UN had blessed this arrangement. So already that it was now established at the UN that they were to be given independence, the UN understood the scope of what the gravity of granting Libya their independence. They understood all of that, and it was good, right? It was good. The Britain and France accepted it. The United States established a air base there, and Libya entered the international system with recognition, not isolation. Okay, because imagine if it was done abruptly and you just try and then force the situation. Sometimes you can gain independence for your state, but the United Nations and the international community do not recognize you because of the way in which you gained power. But that didn't happen because the international community had blessed this arrangement. The third advantage we look at is stability through tradition. So Idris brought religious authority, right, and resistance credentials. He was King Idris was part of the anti-colonial struggle against Italy, so it gave him credentials. And older Libyans, particularly in Cyrenaica, accepted his rule as legitimate. He actually came from Cyrenaica, so it's no surprise that people of Cyrenaica really understood or really legitimized his rule. So the system didn't need to enforce itself constantly because they understood that no, because Libya was so religious, they understood having a person like King Idris as their leader. Now, advantage number 4 was there was gradual development, and this is we're saying gradual development without oil, and we're going to come back to this point, when we're looking at the structural constraints. That here, when I'm talking about the advantage of gradual development, we're talking about the state growing slowly without oil. Let's look at the successes. Between 1951 and 1959, the constitutional system uh, achieved real success, right? So, success number 1, we had peaceful integration. So, despite regional differences, no armed conflict erupted, right? We mentioned it within the advantages that yes, there was no conflict between Cyrenaica, Tripoli, and Fezzan. The federal formula worked well enough to prevent fragmentation, because once we have fragmentation within states, then we have a situation where the state would then be destabilized. Success number 2, the basic state infrastructure was established. So a national currency was established, the Libyan pound, a postal system, customs administrations, making sure that nothing illegal comes into the country, foreign ministry, basic legal framework. Basically, this was your basic state infrastructure, or what I would like to say, your basic superstructure, which still needed substructure. But we'll go on to that later on in this video. Then success number 3, international integration. Libya then joined the Arab League 1953. The UN then allowed Libya to join 1955. So the UN managed to make Libya independent by 1952, then allowed them to join by 1955. It established diplomatic relationships with major powers. It existed as a state within the international system. So all was rosy, right? Success number 4, administrative capacity. A civil service emerged, budgets were drafted, taxes were collected, laws enforced, minimally but genuinely. By 1959, Libya had what it possessed to have a functioning state apparatus, right? So, yeah, everything was working well until oil was discovered. Oil changed everything, and it exposed the very structural constraints which I've been hinting towards in my explanation of the Monarchy Constitution and Libya's basically their first institution. It exposed the structural constraint, and the constitution had not really been designed to resolve economical power. You see, it knew how to distribute political power, but it didn't know how to distribute economical power. And that's what the oil basically brought. It brought economical power to Libya, and the constitution just didn't know how to deal with that particular situation. So, constraint number 1, there were weak political parties. So, political parties were banned in 1952 after election disturbances. Without parties, Parliament became a collection of notables, so tribal leaders and business interests. No national platforms, no organized opposition, no way to aggregate interest across regions. The constitution created parliament but no politics. So, as I said, the superstructure the superstructure was there, that there was a parliament for Libya, but there was no substructure to make sure that this parliament was strong. And a parliament is plays a major factor towards how the system is, how a country is supposed to be stable. The system of the country is supposed to be stable. So without that necessary substructure, it led to a structural constraint of Libya. Then we move on to constraint number 2, the federal friction. You see, the constitution distributed powers between centers and regions, but oil revenue flowed to the center. So provinces became dependent on Tripoli for funding. So basically, I explained it that the constitution understood political power, but it just didn't translate into economic power. And that's basically a summary of what I was trying to explain within constraint number two. Then we move on to constraint number three, that is the royal dominance, right? The constitution gave Idris extensive powers. So King Idris now could appoint and dismiss prime ministers at will, dissolving parliament, commanding the armed forces, sanctioning laws. There was no legislation that was going to stop him from doing that. So he didn't rule absolutely, but he didn't rule absolutely. He didn't need to. The ministers served at his pleasure. Parliament could be dismissed. The constitution's checks and balances became irrelevant when everyone depended on the king, right? Because the king, there was nothing that could stop King Idris from doing these things. And that, again, that is the substructure that was needed within the superstructure of appointing an individual like King Idris. Constraint number four was that there was no succession mechanism. So Idris's son had died in infancy, died young. His designated successor, his brother, predeceased him. So his brother died. So there was no one there was no mechanism in place to make sure that if King Idris was not there, there was going to be another person that was going to be replacing him. By the 1960s, there was no crown prince. Just imagine. No established process for transition, no agreement on who would follow. The constitution had created a monarchy without an heir, so there was no one to take his place. Now, you see, these constraints were manageable when the state was poor, but once oil came, it made everything fatal. Now, we then move on to the disadvantages. Now, you see, disadvantage number one is that there was patronage without institutions. So, there was oil money that funded government jobs, infrastructure subsidies, but it flowed through the palace, not through institutions. I'm not really going to look at disadvantages that much because I think I've touched on the structural constraints. But what we will look at is that there was no military institution. So the armed forces remained small, about 5,000 men, just imagine, deliberately so. I just feared a strong military in the fear that the military could stage a coup. But however, officers were trained abroad, mostly in Britain. Ultimately, the officers then ended up effecting somewhat of a coup, but that's another topic for another day. But there was no Libyan military academy, no officers corps with shared identity, no institution that soldiers would die for. The constitution created a military command structure, but no military institution. So, yeah, you get to understand the situation where there was no ethos, so that the military becomes loyal to the state. Everybody had their own ideology, and when you're dealing with an army, you'd want a consistent ideology so that there's stability within your military. Disadvantage number four was that there was no economic stakeholders. This would have solved the issue of the oil if they had stakeholders, because then it would have allowed a better distribution of the economy in terms of the oil revenue. Disadvantage number five was generational alienation. By the late 1960s, a generation had grown up that didn't remember the Italian occupation or the independence struggle, which creates a problem. If you've got an entire generation that doesn't understand what the people before them did to try and gain their independence, then you have a situation where the state becomes disjointed. So for this generation, the constitution wasn't sacred. It was a colonial inheritance. Why? Because the constitution, what they basically saw was British and American bases, right? A king who spent months abroad for medical treatment, corruption in the royal circle, Nasser's speeches about Arab unity and revolution. They were seeing all of this, and they didn't understand that they could now see Western institutions within their country. They didn't understand that these Western institutions had been put in place just as a form of transition, so that the country can become stable. That they used to actually be occupied, and they were granted independence so that they can transition into a more stable region. But unfortunately, the youth didn't see it that way, and this led to instability in its own way. Now, let's look at the points of conflict. The center versus region. So Cyrenaica felt that the king had abandoned his home. Remember, I mentioned that the King Idris came from Cyrenaica, and once Tripoli now started having oil, the king now started focusing most of his attention on Tripoli, right? Fezan felt ignored entirely, right? Because yeah, you can get the picture that Tripoli had oil. Fezan and Cyrenaica didn't have as much oil as Tripoli, and that led to them being disregarded. Tripoli felt Tripoli felt underrepresented despite its population. So just imagine you've got all this economical power, but within parliament you're not being represented well. Then traditional versus modern. Idris represented an older generation, the Ottoman era birth, the Sanusi religious authority, cautious diplomacy. That's what he represented, the old guard. The young officers wanted a person like Nasser, rapid modernization, nationalism, anti-imperialism. The point of conflict number three was foreign bases versus sovereignty. I talked about it, how a lot of the youth, because they didn't understand the history of why the British and American institutions were finding their way in Libya. They didn't understand that, and because they didn't understand that, it then led to a situation where people had grievances against somewhat having colonial, what they believed as colonial institutions within their country. Then Palestine solidarity, right? So after 1967, Arab nationalism surged, and Libya's monarchy looked increasingly out of touch with their popularity, with the population. Because remember, they were in good they had good relations within the international community, and most of the international community was somewhat keeping a very neutral stance within what was happening with Palestine. And for the Arabs that were in Libya, they felt that Libya, right, that the constitution offered no way to channel this energy, no parties, no movement politics, no participation, to allow Libya to be in solidarity with the Arab community when they were now trying to be in solidarity with Palestine. They felt that the constitution was failing at that. Then the succession question, which again I mentioned prior, that there was no succession for who was going to be the next leader of Libya, and that was a massive problem. I've mentioned it before. Now, what was the ultimate cause of Libya? Not the ultimate cause of Libya falling. We're talking about what was the ultimate cause of the monarchy constitution absolutely collapsing. Now, this is where we now look at when King Idris now travels to Turkey for medical treatment. The man was now 80. So, this is now September 1, 1969. He's now ruled for over 18 years. But you see, he had made the whole system about himself, where he could now remove and appoint ministers. He could basically do whatever he wanted because the constitution had that gap within it. Once he left, he also left behind, he then leaves behind a constitution, a parliament, a cabinet, a military, a provincial government. All of these institutions were weak because it all centered around him. So, what simply happened is a group of officers then seizes the radio station, military barracks, and key government buildings. There's almost no resistance because remember, these institutions, these superstructures are weak. They're easy to capture. Why? Why is that the case? Because the military didn't fight, right? Because now I'm gonna break it down. The military didn't fight because it had no institutional loyalty to the monarchy. I mentioned it before that everybody were kind of like on their own different wavelengths in terms of, there was no unifying ethos to the military. Parliament didn't convene because it had no mechanism to respond to emergencies. All of this would have been discussed within Parliament. That's why you need political parties so that you can, try and understand the different gaps within your constitution. The cabinet didn't organize. because ministers served at royal pleasure. So the cabinets didn't know exactly how to go about it because the king wasn't there. So the king really understood how to basically make sure that the cabinet could convene and make decisive decisions. Without without the king being there, the cabinet really couldn't affect anything because they had no authority. The provincial governors waited to see who could win. They were also waiting because, again, they didn't have any power. All they simply understood was that the king is the one who usually makes or does most of the decisions, and anything that doesn't align with the king just doesn't pass. So they didn't even have power. So the constitution remained on paper, but the institutions that created were hollow. The superstructures were there, the substructures had not been put in place. So when pressure came, they didn't defend themselves because they had no self to defend. So the ultimate cause of failure, the monarchy constitution created the superstructure without a substructure. It built a parliament without parties, a military without institutional identity, a monarchy without succession, a stake without stakeholders. By stake, we're talking about the oil, a system without defenders. When the king left, the system left with him, not because the constitution was destroyed, but because it was never built. So, in conclusion, the Monarchy Constitution of 1951 was Libya's first attempt at institutional order. It failed because it created superstructure without substructure, oil wealth concentrated power without building stakeholders. The military was kept weak to prevent coups, which made it unable to defend the system. No parties, no succession mechanisms, no independent economic class. A generation stopped believing. When Idris left, the system didn't fall, it simply was already hollow. Gaddafi understood this. He also understood that building real institutions would create rivals, so he built nothing that could outlast him. But he built one thing, a military, a fragmented, deliberately weakened, deliberately prevented from becoming an institution. In episode 2, we look in depth in why Gaddafi kept his army weak. Now, I hope to see you guys soon in the next episode where we're going to dive in deep on this particular episode on Gaddafi and his military. I think we're actually going to entitle episode 2 the military. Yeah, that's what we're doing. The Constitution created institutions on paper, but paper didn't defend itself. The Constitution created institutions on paper, but paper doesn't defend itself. So I leave this video asking you one particular question. Can a constitution create a state without creating institutions that can defend it? Or is every system only as strong as the structure it builds, not the documents it signs?